You know, what we may be is in trouble because I don't have any notes. I forgot when I left the house to put my notes on my iPad, so now we're doomed. If I ever find the right one. I've got printed copies of those outline notes that I did the first week that I told you I would do a long time ago. And that's all it is outlines. So I'm going to set it right there and you can bug me for them when we get through. We're going to go to Psalm 86 is where I want to go. Where is Psalms? It's in the Old Testament, right? Okay, this is going to be kind of a weird prayer this morning because most of us don't think of ourselves as being assaulted by enemies. This is actually a prayer that David prayed, and he just, got all kinds of problems all the time. People are always, you know how it would be if you were a politician, even if you're the king and you're running things, you're gonna have a lot of enemies. But I think probably if we think about our lives, we think about ourselves running up against those assaults and things against us and things attacking us and things bothering us. In light of what we read in Numbers, I think this is a really appropriate psalm because it's about the faithfulness of God. About the faithfulness of God when we're in trouble, when we're in the wilderness, when we're caught in sin, all kinds of things. And so if you will be ready, Psalm 86, if you want to read it along with me. I'm reading from the NIV, the newer version of the NIV. So here we go. We're going to pray together. Hear me, Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy. Guard my life, for I'm faithful to you. Save your servant who trusts in you. You are my God. Have mercy on me, Lord, for I call to you all day long. Bring joy to your servant, Lord, for I put my trust in you. You, Lord, are forgiving and good, abounding in love to all who call you. Hear my prayer, Lord. Listen to my cry for mercy. When I am in distress, I call to you because you answer me. Among the gods, there is none like you, Lord. No deeds can compare with yours. All the nations you have made will come and worship before you, Lord. They will bring glory to your name. For you're great and do marvelous deeds. You alone are God. Teach me your way, Lord, that I may rely on your faithfulness. Give me an undivided heart that I may fear your name. I will praise you, Lord my God, with all my heart. I will glorify your name forever, for great is your love toward me. You have delivered me from the depths, from the realm of the dead. Arrogant foes are attacking me, O God. Ruthless people are trying to kill me. They have no regard for you. But you, Lord, are a compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness. Turn to me and have mercy on me. Show your strength in behalf of your servants. Save me, because I serve you just as my mother did. Give me a sign of your goodness, that my enemies may see it and be put to shame. For you, Lord, have helped me and comforted me. Amen. That's a neat psalm. That's a psalm about relying on the faithfulness of God. The fact that God has the character of being steadfast. All the way through this psalm, you'll have this interchange of faithfulness and hesed and I forgot what the Hebrew word is for faithfulness, but anyway, you'll have that interchange between steadfast love some of the versions translate it. It just translates it love in the NIV, but it's a kind of a love a loyal love, a loyalty that's stressed in that love. And then faithfulness, where there is the truth that God is disseminating among his people, but that truth is the faithfulness of God. He is there to protect him. And so he talks in verse 1, he will talk about, hear me, Lord, hear me and answer me. Guard my life, he says in verse 2. Have mercy on me, for and you have this idea of the servant being faithful as well. Save your servant who trusts in you, verse 2. I call to you all day long. Verse 4, I put my trust in you because. And he starts ticking off all of the things that God is forgiving and good, abounding in chesed. This is steadfast love to all who call you. Verse 7, when I call to you, you answer. Verse 8, nobody's deeds can compare with yours. Verse 9, the whole world is going to come to you and worship you because you are great and you do marvelous deeds. Then he prays teach me your way, Lord, that I can rely on your faithfulness. And notice in that particular verse how faithfulness and truth kind of go together. Teach me your way. There's the idea of show me truth so that I can rely on your faithfulness. And that word is again, that word faithfulness in Hebrew is a word that means both truth and being loyal or being faithful. So that truth and faithfulness go together. Out of that, verse 12, comes the fact that I will be faithful. He talks about in verse 16, save me because I serve you just as my mother did. That may not be everybody's experience here. You may have had to go against some of the things your mother believed in. You know, in the Old Testament, when you read about the kings, it's always their mother that is listed as the reason they were made king. It's almost there's some argument in scholarly circles about whether the king was made king because he was the descendant of his father or of his mother. There's something about that mother business. Now, it's always because of the father, obviously. I mean, the kings of Judah were descendants of David, and so it was through their father that their lineage was reckoned. But they will always mention their mother. And it's like the mothers are the formative influences on these guys, whether they're good or bad kings. And David talks about my mother and being a part of that faithfulness. So, all right, we're going to go to Numbers and finish up kind of our run through Numbers chapter by chapter. We were looking, we'd gotten past the first 10 chapters where you have the census and the camp of Israel and the Levites being set out, the laws that God gives them, the vows, the laws about vows when you're trying to honor God in a special way. This is how you do it. Tabernacle is dedicated. Levites, silver trumpets. Israel then marches in chapter 10. All of those are really setting up the ideal community. This is Israel when things are going well. I mean, everybody's happy. You've got the census taking place. These people, there's just scads of these people all over the place. We're going to talk about that a little bit later if we get to it. You've got the Levites being there to protect the tabernacle in the center of the camp, God's presence with them. Although that presents some great danger. That's both a blessing and a danger because holiness is called for. Loyalty to God is called for since God is living in the midst of their camp. And so they have to be careful about how they live there. And so God graciously provides them the Levites who are said to protect them from the outbreak of God's own holiness. And you have then Israel headed toward the promised land. And things immediately go south. Numbers 11, the people start complaining. You brought us out here to die. We never get anything else to eat except manna. It's manna, 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 manna every day. And by the way, we think of manna as being this wonderful food, God provided the food. Do you know what manna means? The word manna in Hebrew means? It's actually the Hebrew word minhu, which means men is what, and who is basically it. Minhu, what is it? Have you ever had what is it? That's what the Israelites were eating all the way across the desert. They had no idea what this was, and they're having to eat it. And so they get tired of that real quick. Now, interestingly enough, God responds graciously in chapter 11. It's hard to see it because in 11 is where Moses is just about fed up with everybody, and he goes to God and says, "What's the matter with you? Why'd you stick me with all these people? Why have I got to carry them across the desert?" And God says, "Okay, I'm going to feed them. I'm going to bring them meat." They're wanting meat, not just food, but they're wanting meat to eat. I'm going to give them meat to eat. But then he tells the Israelites, you're not going to eat it for 1 day or 2 days or a week or a month. You're going to eat it till it is running out your nose. And you're going to be so sick of meat that you can't stand it anymore. So in one sense, God is very gracious in dealing with the Israelites. But in another sense, they are being punished pretty big. They finally get what they want. And they get punished by getting what they want. Only they get way more of it than they probably thought that they would ever get. But God responds graciously as well as bringing his harsh judgment. And you remember on Mount Sinai when Moses said, "Show me your glory." And God says to him in chapter 34 of Exodus, "Well, sorry, I can't do that because my glory would kill you. But I will let you see my backside." That's an interesting way of talking about the appearance of God. He doesn't see God from the front where all of God's glory. You kind of see God from the backside, the lesser part of God. You know, when we turn our back to somebody, that's an insult, right? Or we're afraid, or we're running. Our back is kind of not the. If you really want to be a strong person, what do? You face somebody. Well, you can't see my face, God says, so I'm going to show you my back. And God then speaks his name, the Lord, gracious and compassionate, and he gives that long string of things that the Lord is. But he also says, I forgive those people who sin against me to the 3rd and 4th generation, but I punish the sins of the fathers. I bring the sins of the fathers even on the children. And so there is always that goodness and graciousness of God that's balanced off with the goodness and judgment of God. He doesn't just leave people in the state they're in. Think about Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve living in this perfect place. They're living in the paradise of God. They're eating from the tree of life. They're living. They're not living because God made them to live forever. Human beings are not immortal in and of themselves. Adam and Eve if they live forever, if they ever lived forever, it was because they were feeding from the tree that God provided for them. And so when they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, what happens then? What's the result of eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil for Adam and Eve? They become sinful. Now, we become sinful, we do a little bit of thing. God says, I'm going to kill you for that. And they start to die. Now, we think of that as being totally horrible. I mean, it's horrible. They got the death penalty. But imagine what it would be like to live forever in a sinful state. And things just going downhill and downhill and downhill and downhill. You get to the flood, and God takes a look at the world, and God said, this world is ruined. So what are we going to do with it? What happened at the flood? They destroyed it. He destroyed it. He destroyed it completely, except for Noah and a few things. But it's really a gracious act of God to bring death into the world, because death means I don't have to live in this corrupted, weak, sinful state forever. Now, God is going to do something about that, and in Jesus we're raised from the dead, and we're restored to God's glory and God's creation and all of that kind of thing. Things go well, but understand God's justice, God's goodness and forgiveness is always balanced off with that business of cleaning up sin, taking care of sin, judgment takes place. He does not let Israel, God doesn't just hold up his hands and say, okay, guys, you rebelled, and I forgive you, and we'll just go on from here. And Israel just keeps on being the same old rotten people they were before, rebelling against God and complaining about this and that, and spoiled rotten about all of these kinds of things. But God confronts them and punishes their sin. And do they learn their lesson? Well, no, they keep on sinning. But what eventually happens to that generation that's at the foot of Mount Sinai in chapter 1 of Numbers? They all die, except for Joshua and Caleb. Joshua and Caleb are the only two that walk away from Numbers unscathed. Everybody else dies, even Moses. So it's God's judgment that rests on these people. So at any rate, we're in chapter 11. We looked at chapter 11 where God's judgment is brought on the people as well as his forgiveness. Then in chapter 12, you have Miriam and Aaron complaining. They decide they should be the leaders because they're smarter than Moses. After all, he's just my dumb little brother. And they're also complaining that he married the wrong woman, which I don't really know. We'll look at that when we get there. But the Lord brings judgment on them. He doesn't strike Aaron with leprosy. Aaron is a priest. And for Aaron to be hit with leprosy means the priesthood is corrupted and there's some unholiness that resides in the priesthood. But he strikes Miriam with leprosy and it scares Aaron to death. And Aaron begins to plead, and the Lord then responds graciously, again, brings them back into the camp, and off we go. Chapter 13 then, we're at the foot of the promised land. We're on the map. I'll bring a map and we'll look at the map. Did you've seen it? They're in Kadesh Barnea. They're ready to go up into the promised land from the south, kind of the soft underbelly of Palestine. And Moses sends 12, we call them spies. Any of you guys are in the army? Some of you guys are in the army. What they call them, recon patrols? Is that what they call those? Yeah, recon patrol. That's really what this is, a recon patrol. Just go up in there and look at the place out, find out where the strongholds are, find out where things are going, and come back and report to us. Tell us what we need to do when we go up in there to attack. They come back and they say, we can't attack that place. I mean, you're familiar with the story. These people are huge. They've got walls on their cities that are up to the sky, and they just keep complaining about how tough it's going to be to conquer the land. Now, that's ironic because in the census in chapter 1, they count 602,000 soldiers. Now, I don't remember what the size of the army was at any one particular time in Vietnam, but I guarantee you it wasn't 602,000 soldiers. It was more like 100 to 150,000, I think. But at any rate, these guys have got 600,000 soldiers. They know the count, and God says, go up in the land, and what do they say? They're going to eat us alive. There's no way. There's not enough of us, ever. We're not strong enough. There is that irony that takes place in that between the census and the assessment of the spies. At any rate, the spies recommend don't go in there. Then you have Numbers 14. Israel then responds and rebels by refusing to enter the promised land. God says, back up Moses, I'm going to kill them all. And Moses begins to pray and intercede. Part of leadership. Leadership is going to be a big deal, and we're going to talk quite a bit about leadership as we move through the book of Numbers. But Moses, in his leadership capacity, prays for Israel, and God relents. Graciously, God relents. But again, he brings harsh judgment on those people. They start to die like crazy. The plague strikes, and then God tells them, you're not going into the land. You're all going to die out here in the wilderness. But your children will go in. Then in Numbers 15, well, at the end of chapter 14, it's almost inconceivable. Israel rebels again. After God tells them, don't go up there, they say, no, we're going to go anyway. And they do exactly the opposite than they did at the first of the chapter, and they decide to go up there. Of course, God punishes them again. Then in Numbers 15, interestingly enough, you have the offerings, God's provision for forgiveness. And so God is establishing all of these all of these offerings for forgiveness. But he includes, there's a warning in there as well in chapter 15. There are two types of sin. What are the two types of sin? Big sins and little sins? Not big sins and little sins. We think that way, but that's not the distinction God makes. What is his distinction? Unintentional and intentional. Which ones can be forgiven? Unintentional can be forgiven. Intentional sin. It's called sin with a high hand, when you just say, hey, I don't care what you say, I'm going to do it anyway. God said, you're in real trouble there. And he warns the Israelites about those rebellious, high-handed sins. And so there's probably, we'll talk about that when we get to 15. Then you go to number 16. And remember, the chapter in between 14, Israel's rebellion, and chapter 16 is chapter 15, God talking about forgiveness and intentional and unintentional sin. In chapter 16, then, you have Korah's rebellion. I mean, you sometimes walk away from Numbers thinking, how stupid are these guys? I mean, they just keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over. Then you think, how many times have I thought about that myself, that I keep doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over. At any rate, there is another rebellion of Korah and the Reubenites, and then all Israel joins in their rebellion. Now, again, you've got to see what's happening in the book of Numbers. I mean, Yahweh is graciously providing a way for Israel to live in holiness and harmony with him. His camp is in the middle. His tabernacle is in the middle of their camp. But their first impulse is always to turn away from him. But then Yahweh always provides a way of forgiveness for them. Even though it may be mixed with very harsh judgment, he provides a way for them to be cleansed. But you just keep having, in the middle parts, in the wilderness, you keep having these interchanges between God's forgiveness and Israel's rebellion, and God's forgiveness and Israel's rebellion, and it just keeps going on that way. Chapter 17 then, after Korah's rebellion, you have the reestablishment of the priesthood. Aaron, it's rod buds, and everybody knows that Aaron is the high priest. But the priests and Levites are then provided to protect the people from God. They are there to do the religious worship that unites Israel with God, but they are the ones who are going to take the pain if things go wrong. Then you have in chapter 18 of Numbers the privileges and the responsibilities of the priests and the Levites. We'll talk some about that. And then in Numbers 19 is a whole chapter about purification from death. Death is always the threat against God's people. Death is the theme in paradise, in Genesis. When Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, death ensued. Death pursues people all the way through. Death is a mark of a lack of holiness in the broader sense. Okay? It didn't mean that, you died and therefore that meant you were a horrible sinner because God struck you dead. That's not the point. The point is death as a human experience it's just wrong. Anytime people die, one of the things we say, even if we say they're better off, they were suffering horribly, they're in a better place, we just go on and on and on, we also have that thought back in the back of our mind, this is not right. We grieve over those who die, right? And it's not like, well, it's okay that they're gone. I've moved away from people before. I grew up in Malamar, New Mexico, mostly. I grew up in Hobbs a little bit. I grew up in Lovington a little bit. Every time I left those places, I had left behind friends. And I didn't worry about it. I figured, I'll see them again sometime or other. And not, I was off to new adventures and new places. But death is a little bit different. Death is pretty final. You're not going to see them again. Death is what is wrong. And God provides a way then for the Israelites in Numbers 19 to be purified from this contamination of death. There is a kind of hope in Numbers 19 that's more of a hope than just of getting into the promised land. There's a hope of life being better because God can overpower death. And maybe there's a hint in Numbers 19 about resurrection. I don't know. Numbers 20, Israel rebels again. This time they don't have water, and they get mad at Moses because they don't have water. And Moses says, I'll take care of it. And he goes up and he strikes the rock. And God said, hey, because you thought if this was all about you, you're going to die. They've taken care of death in Numbers 19. Now Moses dies, or is going to die. Edom then refuses to allow Israel to pass through their land, and Aaron does die at the end of chapter 20. So this death of this leadership, the death of this old generation is starting to really take hold. Numbers 21, you have some victories. Victory over Arad. And then Israel fails again. They start grumbling and complaining, and God sends snakes among them. And the snakes bite them, and people start dying. I don't know why it is. I hate snakes. The only good snake is a dead snake. I mean, I stomp garter snakes, you know. My grandson, Cohen, loves to play with snakes. He lives in Nebraska, where apparently there are no deadly snakes in the part of the world he lives in. I worry about that kid all the time because he'll see a snake and run and pick it up. I tell him throw it down and then I kill it. You know, I mean, there are no good snakes, right? I watch videos about pit vipers, about these kind of vipers that are in the Sinai Peninsula. And when people get bit by those things, they don't live long. You know, I mean, this is like death attacking. And I know the King James Version talked about snakes of fire, you know, fiery snakes. The idea is that they have fiery bites. It hurts when they bite you. As a matter of fact, well, we won't go into all that. We might talk about that a little bit later. How does God forgive those people when they, you know, here they are grumbling, they get bit by a snake? What do they do to get healed? They have to go and look at a snake. Hey, think about that now, okay? Because you put a snake up on a pole and you say, go and look at that, and then you can be healed. When you look at that snake, what does that remind you of? If you've been bitten already, you go look at the snake, all that reminds you of is I deserve exactly everything I got. I mean, this is horrible. I mean, it's not God just saying, okay, if you'll come and look at the snake, we'll work a little magic and heal you. What God is demanding, they have to confront their sin. They have to look themselves in the face when they go and they look at that snake. Now, they can be healed, but they have to confront their sin. What about the cross? Is the cross a pretty thing or an ugly thing? Anybody got guts enough to say yes? It's both. What's ugly about the cross?
What's pretty about it?
Well, tell me what's ugly about the cross. All right, it's death, it's suffering, it's dishonor, shameful. The Romans wouldn't even talk about crosses. I mean, the word cross was an obscene word. It was like a cuss word with us. We use sexual words for cuss words. They use crosses as cuss words.
But it's torture.
It's torture. It's all of those things. What's pretty about the cross? I mean, how many of you have a cross around your neck today? I left mine. I stopped wearing mine because I can't get it around my neck. I've lost enough weight I can probably get it around my neck again. But why do we wear crosses? Because they're attractive. Because Jesus, it's the sacrifice that God makes to put us back together with Him. There are some pretty things. See, this snake that's up in the wilderness, the snake is both ugly and pretty. It represents healing, but it's also the ugliness of Israel's rebellion against God and their constant complaining. So there's always that, just like death, you know, there's kind of an in and out kind of thing that goes on there. Then you go to Numbers 22 through 24. And I'm going to look at those all four. You have in 22 Moab's determination to ruin Israel. I mean, Moab wants to get rid of Israel, and so they go and hire Balaam, who is he's a prophet, but you have to be careful with that word. It's not like he's a godly prophet. He is just some guy he's an occult prophet. You know, he's kind of a Satan worshiper kind of guy. And so we're going to bring Balaam in and pay him a lot of money. And Balaam keeps protesting, I can only do what the Lord tells me to say. I can only say what the Lord tells me to say. I can only say what the Lord tells me to say. And Balaam will say something like, I'll give you $500,000 if you'll curse the Israelites. And Balaam says, wait, I'm going to go talk to the Lord and see what he wants me to say. And he comes back and says, I can't do it for 500,000. And Balak says, how about $1 million? And Balaam says, I'll go back and talk to the Lord. It just keeps, it's that kind of thing. So don't ever read Balaam stories as Balaam being a good guy and actually listening to God. I mean, God, when Balaam God tells Balaam, go. He finally tells him, go. But you only say what I tell you to say. And Balaam said, okay, I'll do it, brother. And he takes off on a donkey, and God tries to kill him 3 times. Until finally Balaam realizes, I've been wrong this entire time. And he goes and he tries to curse Israel, builds 7 altars. Balak gives him all of these sacrificial animals. Balaam is ready to pronounce the curse, and he opens his mouth to speak, and what comes out? Amazing blessings. And Balaam is overpowered by the Lord and only can say what the Lord wants him to say. And so what you have is kind of an irony going on. Down in the camp of Israel, you've got rebellion, you've got bad-mouthing God, all those people complaining all the time that God's not doing good enough for us, and we're hungry and we're thirsty and we're hot and we're tired. And up on the hill, here is this ungodly wretch of a human being, and he is pronouncing the most amazing blessings on Israel you can imagine. Things are a little bit backwards here in 22 through 24. Well, they're not a little bit backwards. They're a lot backwards in 22 through 24. And so we will talk about that irony. In Numbers 25, since you can't curse Israel, Balaam says to Balak essentially, now it's not said, that's not said in 25, but this is what happens. Balaam says to Balak, you know what? You don't need me up there cursing them. What you need to do is send your young women down there and seduce those guys and get them to sleep with their young men, have sexual relations with their young men, and then that is tied to false worship as well. And so you have the seduction of Israel in Numbers 25. Now in 26, there's a new break in the book. The second half of the book starts. It's not really the second half like if we pull the pages up, but the second half of the book starts in Numbers 26. Things take off in a new direction with a new generation. You have a new census. And incredibly enough, when they count all the number of Israelites, and all of this rebellion's going on, and all of the old generation has all died off. Moses is just waiting to die. He's going to die in the book of Deuteronomy, which is the next book after this. But you've got all these dead people lying around everywhere. How many people are counted in the second census compared to the first census? Got any guesses? More, less, do what? About the same. I mean, can you imagine God bringing all these people through and killing all of these people, and then they're still about the same size as they were before? I mean, God is being faithful to Israel. He is determined to bring them to the promised land, but He's going to do that with a people who will worship and honor Him, and not a bunch of people who want to rebel against Him all the way through the desert. So there's something that's to be said about that. Then in Numbers 27, you have the laws about inheritance. The daughters of Zelophehad come up and say, our dad died, didn't have any boys, and now our inheritance is going to go to somebody besides our dad's family. What do we do about that? And God makes a new rule that says women can inherit if there are no other inheritors. But the idea of that's not just a rule. The idea is there's a pretty significant future. Who is included in the people of Israel? Huh? The women as well as the men. All the tribes, the Levites, the common people as well as the Levites. I mean, there's something to be said about the future for Israel. Not only that, but they're still out in the wilderness, right? And they're talking about inheritance in the land of Canaan across the Jordan. And you're thinking, wait a minute, what have you got to inherit? Oh, we're inheriting, we believe God's promise. God is faithful. He's going to get us there. We'll talk about that. Numbers 28 and 29, you have all the festivals and the offerings. And again, where do you celebrate those festivals and make those offerings? Not in the wilderness, you do it in the promised land. When you get to the promised land, this is what happens. God is going to get them there. Number 30, there is again a stress on vows. If you want to really honor God in a special way, this is the way you do it. Numbers 31, you have victory over Midian, and also you have the contamination of death and the division of the spoils. You don't just go around killing people. You know, the march of Israel across the promised land is not going to be a celebration of death, blood and gore and all that kind of horrible stuff. Death contaminates. When you kill somebody, even if he's an enemy, there has to be some purification that takes place. Death is an unholy thing. I mean, you guys, if any of you guys are veterans that had to fight, you know, I mean, my best friend, one of my closest friends was a veteran, but he was always behind a desk in Saigon, and he never worried about getting shot. You know, he said, I had the greatest job in the world. I've talked to other guys, and they fought for their lives, and it was horrible, some of the things. A lot of those guys won't even talk about it. It was so awful. Well, God wants these Israelites to remember, fellas, this is not going to be a walk in the park and just doo-dah all the way through. Death is a bad thing, even killing your enemies. When Jesus says in the New Testament, love your enemies, this is not something that's new to the Israelites. This is something they understood, that we're supposed to treat our enemies with respect, but there also is a time when you have to cleanse out things. I mean, even Israelites die, right? And a lot of their enemies die, but nevertheless, we will probably talk about that. Numbers 32, you have the Reubenites and the Gadites, and then kind of incidentally the half-tribe of Manasseh that decide they don't want to go into the promised land. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, what happened back in chapter 11 and 12 and 13 and 14 and all of those back in there when the spies said, oh, we can't go in there, let's don't go in. And the Israelites didn't go in. What happened? That whole generation died, yeah. So you're kind of left wondering, you know, is this really a good thing or a bad thing? Now, God in His grace makes it a good thing. He makes it a good thing in the sense that now Israel not only has the promised land, which is all the land west of the Jordan River, now they have land east of the Jordan River. Wow. I mean, already we hadn't even got there yet, and God is growing our country, growing our land. Yeah, that's fabulous. And so you have then in Numbers 33 the stages of the journey, kind of a, what do we call it, an itinerary. We went from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, all the way through the desert. But the idea is we got through the desert. I do that today. I've got a little BMW. Lynette bought a BMW. That's her car. But on the dash, I can punch a button and it throws a map up there. And I can drive by that map all day long because I drive from here to Happy. And I know I'm almost to Happy. I can see it. I can drive from Carlsbad to Seven Rivers, to Artesia. You know, hey, how are you? Hi, Scholar. My sister and her daughter are here. They came from Lubbock this morning. So if you meet somebody that didn't come to church because it was too far to come across the street, they're here from Lubbock. So anyway, I hate those kind of things. You ever read those smart alecky little deals about why you're not in church and on Facebook? And I don't like those. But anyway. All right, Numbers 34, you have the dividing of the land of Canaan. How do you divide it up? And here's the way you divide it up. Numbers 35, you have the establishment of Levitical towns, cities of refuge. God reminds the people, I am still in your midst. I am still there. And the Levites are important, and here are cities of refuge for when death takes place. Numbers 36, you have some more inheritance issues, and that's the guarantee that everybody has an inheritance, and that's where Numbers ends, and that's where the bell rang, and we're just in time. I was going to talk a lot about God's faithfulness. I may run over some things real quickly about God's faithfulness because Numbers, from beginning to end, is a book about God's faithfulness. But I think probably what we will do is we will look at the first 3 chapters of Numbers next week. So if you want to read Numbers 1 through 3, grit your teeth and read all of it. Don't just read Numbers 1 through 4 and then verse 5 and then skip down to verse 40 or whatever it is. You know, I don't want to read all of that. Try to read it like a Hebrew. The Hebrews, when they read that, they'd be going, man, this is the most interesting stuff we ever read. This is great. We read it and think, gee, how repetitious is that stuff? Let's just figure out what the numbers are and go on. We will talk about all of that stuff. Let's pray, please. Holy Father, even in places where we don't relate as well to your word, we are excited by the implications of what goes on in your word. Help us to understand those things, Father, so that we can be well-rounded, we can be mature, we can be excited about your faithfulness and what you are accomplishing among your people in the Old Testament, among us in this new relationship with Christ Jesus. Father, please be with us, and I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. It always takes longer. Thank you.